The farm sat 2 miles outside a town most people only passed through on their way somewhere else. Cracked irrigation ditches. A barn with a roof that sagged in the middle like it was tired of holding itself up. Fields that hadn't seen a full planting in 3 seasons. The man at the feed store told him, not unkindly, that he was buying somebody else's headache. Caleb didn't argue with him. He just asked where the property line ran along the old irrigation channel. A question that, at the time, seemed like nothing more than a mechanic's habit of wanting to understand how a system was put together before deciding whether it was broken. He had no idea that question would matter. Not yet. And somewhere in a filing cabinet 3 towns away, in a folder nobody had opened in over a decade, sat a document that would eventually make a loan officer stop mid-sentence, flip back 2 pages, and read the same paragraph 3 times. If you think overlooked land and overlooked people can still hold on to stories worth telling, that's exactly what we do here at the Rural Files. So stick around, hit subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Caleb had grown up 40 minutes from that farm, the son of a long-haul trucker and a school cafeteria worker, neither of whom had ever owned so much as a garden plot. What he had was an uncle, his mother's brother, a semi-retired hay farmer named Ross, who'd let a restless 12-year-old ride along on equipment repairs instead of sitting inside on summer afternoons. Caleb learned to read a diesel engine's problems the way some kids learn to read a map. By 19, he had his certification and a job at a regional equipment dealership, fixing combines and tractors for farmers 3 times his age who'd stopped asking, "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" after the 2nd or 3rd repair held. What he didn't have was land, and land was the thing he actually wanted. Not out of nostalgia, Caleb wasn't particularly sentimental about dirt, but because 6 years of driving out to other people's farms had shown him something specific. A lot of struggling operations weren't struggling because farming itself was a bad business. They were struggling because of accumulated neglect, deferred maintenance, old infrastructure nobody had looked at hard in years, problems that compounded quietly until they looked unsolvable, when really they were just unaddressed. He figured his mechanical background gave him an edge most first-time buyers didn't have. He could look at broken equipment and broken systems and see what it would actually cost to fix them, instead of guessing. The Delacroix farm, 140 acres, an aging farmhouse, a barn, and irrigation infrastructure that predated Caleb's own grandparents, had been listed for 8 months with no serious offers. The previous owner, an elderly man named Ed Delacroix, had scaled back to almost nothing in his final working years and passed the operation to a nephew who lived out of state and had no interest in farming it himself. The nephew just wanted it sold. Caleb toured the property on a cold March morning. The soil wasn't dead. That was the first thing he noticed. Compacted and undermanaged, yes. Poor drainage in the low western field, yes. But not the kind of chemical wasteland you sometimes find on land that's been farmed too hard for too long. This looked like land that had simply been left alone. That distinction mattered more than most buyers would have known to check for. The farm's decline wasn't mysterious once Caleb started asking questions. It came down to 3 compounding problems, the kind that stack quietly over a decade rather than arriving all at once. First, the primary irrigation pump, an old system fed by a diversion off a seasonal creek, had failed almost 8 years earlier, and Ed Delacroix, already past 70 and slowing down, had never replaced it. Instead, he'd shrunk his planted acreage year over year to match what he could water with a smaller backup system, until farming 140 acres had quietly become farming about 30. Second, without full irrigation, yields on the remaining acreage dropped, which meant less income, which meant less money for the kind of routine maintenance that keeps a farm from sliding further: fence repair, drainage clearing, equipment upkeep. Debt didn't cause this farm's failure so much as slow erosion did. Third, and this part Caleb only pieced together later, nobody currently involved with the property, not Ed, not the nephew, not the real estate agent, seemed to fully understand what water rights, if any, were actually attached to the land. Ed had simply stopped using most of what he was entitled to, and everyone downstream of that decision had assumed stopped using meant wasn't much of a right to begin with. That assumption was wrong. Nobody knew it yet. The purchase price came in at $210,000. low for 140 acres in that region, which told you plenty about how the market was pricing a farm this neglected. Caleb put down just over $18,000 of his savings, financed the rest through a regional agricultural lender, and budgeted what he thought was a realistic first-year repair fund for the irrigation pump and basic fencing. His loan officer, a careful, unflashy woman named Diane Marsh, who'd underwritten agricultural loans in that county for nearly 15 years, wasn't thrilled about the file. Not because Caleb was a bad candidate personally. His credit was clean, and his mechanical trade income gave him a more stable off-farm cushion than most first-year farm buyers had. Her concern was simpler: the collateral. 140 acres with degraded infrastructure and unclear irrigation capacity was, on paper, worth less than the loan amount if things went sideways. She approved it anyway, with tighter reporting requirements than Caleb loved, and a clear message. This farm needs to start generating income within 2 years, or we're going to have a harder conversation. Caleb understood the stakes. He couldn't afford for this to fail. There was no family safety net behind him, no second property to fall back on. It was the savings, the loan, and whatever he could build with both hands. He spent his first weekend on the property, not planting anything, but walking it, the way he'd walk around a piece of equipment before touching a wrench to it. That was where he found the first thing that didn't add up. Along the northern edge of the low field, half buried under a decade of overgrowth, ran a section of iron pipe far heavier and older than anything else on the property. Clearly not part of the newer, smaller backup irrigation system Ed had been using. It ran roughly 40 yards, then simply stopped at a concrete headgate structure that looked, to Caleb's eye, deliberately built rather than improvised. Old, solid, nothing like the patched-together system feeding the 30 acres Ed had still been farming. He asked around. A neighboring farmer, a woman named Patricia Ilo, who'd worked land near the Delacroix place for over 30 years, told him she vaguely remembered the old ditch line from when she was young, something tied to the creek that ran through both properties, but she'd never seen it used in her adult lifetime. She assumed it had been abandoned or replaced generations ago. Caleb didn't know what a headgate that size implied about water allocation. That wasn't his training. But he knew what unused, oversized infrastructure usually meant on a piece of equipment. It had been built to handle more capacity than what was currently running through it. Something wasn't matching up, and mechanically, that always meant something was worth understanding before you ignored it. He mentioned it, almost in passing, during his first quarterly check-in call with Diane. She wrote it down. At the time, it was one line in her notes. The first real setback came in May. Caleb had budgeted $11,000 to repair the existing backup pump system and expand irrigated acreage modestly, from 30 to roughly 50 acres, for his first planting season. Once the contractor actually opened up the pump housing, the damage went deeper than expected. Corroded intake lines, a cracked manifold, wiring that hadn't been up to code in years. The real repair cost came in near $19,000. Caleb covered the gap by delaying fence repairs and taking on freelance mechanical work most weekends, which meant less time on the farm itself during a critical planting window. His 50 acres went in 3 weeks later than ideal. Yields that first season were mediocre, enough to cover operating costs, not enough to make any real dent in the loan or build a reserve. Diane's next site visit came with a pointed question. At this pace, how many years before the farm was generating income beyond break-even? Caleb didn't have a confident answer. He told her the truth, that the current irrigated acreage was capped by what the existing pump could realistically push, and expanding further would require either a costly pump upgrade or some other water source he hadn't identified yet. That conversation was the reason Diane, back at her office a few days later, pulled the full title history on the Delacroix property instead of relying on the summary she'd used at underwriting. She wanted to understand exactly what she held as collateral before deciding how much flexibility to extend Caleb on his next reporting deadline. It took her most of an afternoon. Property records that old weren't always digitized cleanly, and the Delacroix parcel had been split and reassembled twice since the original 1889 filing, once in the 1940s when a portion was sold off, and again in the 1970s when Ed's father had consolidated it back with an adjoining piece. Diane worked backward through deed after deed, cross-referencing legal descriptions that didn't always match modern parcel boundaries exactly. Then she found it. A water right, decreed in 1889, appurtenant to the original parcel, meaning it was legally attached to the land itself, not to whoever happened to own it at a given time, with a priority date that made her sit back in her chair. In a region where water rights operated on a strict seniority system, a right that old put the Delacroix property near the very front of the line. In a dry year, when junior right holders got cut off entirely, an 1889 priority date could mean the difference between a full allocation and none at all. She read the decreed volume twice. It was substantially larger than what Ed Delacroix's small backup pump could have physically delivered in his final farming years, which meant, almost certainly, that the old iron pipe and concrete headgate Caleb had found weren't leftover infrastructure. They were the original delivery system for a right the family had simply stopped fully using once age and shrinking operations caught up with Ed. Diane didn't call Caleb that day. She wanted to be certain first. Because a 130-year-old water right sitting unused for decades raised a second, much less comfortable question, one she'd seen sink other properties before. In this state, water rights could be forfeited through prolonged non-use. If nobody had beneficially used the full right in years, sometimes the threshold was as short as 5 consecutive years. The state's water division could have already administratively canceled it, or it could be vulnerable to cancellation the moment anyone else formally challenged it. The right might be worth almost nothing if it had lapsed, or it might still be one of the most valuable things attached to that farm. She needed the water division's records before she'd know which. When she finally called Caleb in, she laid it out plainly, without exaggeration. There was a very old, very senior water right tied to his land. There was also a real chance it had already been forfeited through disuse, in which case none of this changed anything about his situation. Caleb's first reaction wasn't excitement. It was frustration. He'd been managing a shrinking irrigation budget for over a year, and now he was hearing there might have been a bigger right available the entire time, tangled in paperwork nobody had bothered to untangle. Diane connected him with the State Water Division's regional office. What followed wasn't a single dramatic conversation. It was 3 weeks of phone calls, mailed record requests, and one long afternoon in a county archive room going through diversion records that, fortunately for Caleb, existed in patches going back further than he'd expected. A water rights attorney Diane recommended, a measured, unsentimental man named Andres Filiu, walked Caleb through what he was actually looking at. The good news came first. The right hadn't been formally canceled. In this state, forfeiture for non-use required either a formal declaration process or a private challenge from another water user. And because the Delacroix family had continued diverting some water every year through their smaller backup system, even at reduced volume, the right remained legally alive. Continuous partial use, even well below the full decreed amount, had been enough to keep it from lapsing outright. The complicated news came next. Caleb was only entitled to actually use the portion of the right he could put to beneficial use, meaning he'd need to prove, through real irrigation infrastructure and real crop production, that he could responsibly use more of the allocation before he could rely on it at full volume. And restoring the original delivery system meant real money, clearing and relining the old pipe, rebuilding the headgate to modern safety standards, and filing formal paperwork with the Water Division to document expanded use. Nobody was handing Caleb a fortune. They were handing him a legally protected opportunity, one that still required capital, labor, and time to actually become useful. The obstacle that nearly stopped everything came a few weeks later, when a downstream landowner, a large operation that had been relying on Caleb's decades of non-use to informally access surplus flow during dry months, formally objected once word got around that Caleb intended to restore full use of his senior right. Their attorney argued the right had effectively been abandoned in practice even if not on paper, and requested a state review. It took the Water Division nearly 4 months to resolve. Andres helped Caleb assemble a case, built on the diversion records, the physical evidence of the original infrastructure, and Ed Delacroix's own maintained, if reduced, annual use. The review ultimately confirmed the right's validity and Caleb's standing to restore it. But the delay cost him a second planting season of full expansion and several $1,000s in legal fees he hadn't budgeted for. Diane, watching this play out from the lender's side, extended Caleb's reporting timeline twice during the review, not out of charity, but because a validated senior water right meaningfully improved her own collateral position, and she said as much to him directly. It was, in its own way, the moment the relationship between the two of them shifted from oversight to something closer to partnership. By the following spring, with the review resolved, Caleb rebuilt the original delivery system using a contractor experienced with older agricultural infrastructure, supplementing the labor himself wherever his mechanical background let him cut costs, running new lining through sections of the old pipe himself, rebuilding the headgate's mechanical components rather than replacing the entire structure. The restoration came in near $31,000, financed through a second, smaller loan Diane's bank approved, specifically because the water right materially changed the farm's long-term earning potential. Irrigated acreage expanded gradually, first to 70 acres, then, by the second full season on the restored system, to just over 100. Yields on the newly irrigated ground came in well above what the property had produced in over a decade. Caleb didn't abandon his mechanical work entirely. He kept a smaller freelance repair client base, partly for income stability and partly because, as he put it, fixing other people's equipment was still the thing he understood best and enjoyed most. 2 years after the water rights validity was confirmed, the farm was covering its own operating costs, staying current on both loans, and building a small reserve for the first time since Caleb had bought it. None of this made Caleb wealthy. He'll tell you that plainly if you ask. What it made him was stable, the first stable footing that farm had stood on in over a decade. What stayed with him wasn't the water right itself, but what finding it had actually required. Not luck, but the habit of noticing things that didn't quite add up, and being willing to spend months chasing an answer instead of assuming the previous owner had already figured everything out. Diane still holds the loan. She's said, more than once, that Caleb's file is the only one in her career where the collateral got meaningfully more valuable a year into the term instead of less, and that it happened because a young mechanic asked an unglamorous question about an old pipe on his first weekend walking the land. Patricia Ilo, the neighbor who'd once told him the old ditch line hadn't been used in her lifetime, now leases a small section of Caleb's expanded irrigated acreage for her own overflow crops in wet years. A small, practical arrangement between neighbors that wouldn't have been possible on the farm as it existed when Caleb bought it. The land itself looks different now, but not dramatically so. Fuller fields, fewer gaps in the fence line, a pump house that no longer needs babying through every dry spell. Nothing about it looks like a story from the outside. Caleb still walks the property most weekends, the way he did that first cold March morning. Not looking for anything in particular anymore, just checking how the systems he rebuilt are holding up. He'll tell you the real lesson wasn't about water rights specifically. It's that a struggling piece of land isn't automatically a worthless one. Sometimes it's simply a property nobody has fully understood yet. And in farming, as in engines, most of what looks broken beyond repair is really just something nobody's taken the time to trace back to its source.